Welcome back, boys and ghouls. Spooky season is upon us. Naturally, with this being the most wonderful time of the year, I have big plans for a big project. This project, I wanted to do the project that I had intended to do last year, which is a big 1860s style black Victorian ball gown. But before I could do anything with an outer fabric, I needed a hoop skirt and a petticoat to wear underneath it that's going to give my hoop skirt that volume. In a pinch, reed will work for a hoop skirt. Ideally, you want to use steel, most particularly hooping steel, but I didn't want to pay enough money for enough hooping steel to make a hoop skirt. So I am using 3/4 inch reed boning for this project. And I'm not working off of a pattern or anything. I didn't use a guide for the length of my hoops. I just sort of measured my two longest hoops that I could have used for the skirt because the reed wasn't in one continuous length, and then kind of made it up as I went along and planned to have it not be fantastic when it came to the original draft. It worked okay. Once I had my rough guesstimates, I cut all of my pieces to length and tipped them in electrical tape, which you can use in order to seal off the ends of reed boning channels if you're ever in a position to use reed. Once I had all my measurements, I also went through and sewed my twill tape boning channels, which was actually a bad idea, because I realized very quickly when I finished that these are not nearly wide enough to allow me to do that. This hoop skirt features a bag between the two bottom rungs, or basically a ring of fabric that helps to keep you from sticking your foot through the hoops by just being a barrier. And I'm using some cheap Symphony broadcloth that is a poly cotton blend but was in my stash, so I might as well use it for something that's not going to make me feel like I'm suffocating. My bag was pretty simple to make since I made sure the bottom two boning channels were the exact same length, so I didn't have to worry about them not matching up or doing any sloping. It's just essentially one big tube that goes around with some twill tape sewn to either end to have space to actually slip the bones in. The twill tape obviously finishes off my long raw edges, and the short raw edges are already finished by virtue of them being on the selvage, except for exactly one, because my fabric ended up being almost exactly my finishing desired length of 120 inches. With the channel sewn, I could actually start to insert my boning, and it went okay on the bag. It was a little bit tight, which I was expecting, but you essentially just force your electrical tape tipped bones through the channels with some difficulty. These had a little bit more give since I had actually doubled over with my twill tape channel, so they had a little bit of extra room. But I couldn't close them like regular by machine. After quite a time just barely managing to squeeze my bones into my boning channels, I started measuring them up against one another for a general idea of how large they were in relation to each other, and to see if that made any sense in the grand scheme of how I wanted my boning channels to be on the finished skirt. I didn't have enough black grosgrain ribbon to use exclusively that, and I didn't have enough gray satin ribbon to use exclusively that, so I used a mixture in a way that I at least think looks mildly cool for the vertical strips on the hoop skirt. I sewed them sandwiched between the layers of a folded over piece of twill tape, And that worked well enough once I measured and marked everything in order to make sure that they were the correct amount apart so that my skirt wouldn't do anything wonky when actually worn. And I didn't know exactly how long each of these long vertical bits would need to be, so I just sort of gave it a lot of extra just in case, because the actual circumference of the final hoop skirt, that angle and extra volume does take away a certain amount, and I wasn't sure if I was going to fold them over where it meets the channels or not. I hadn't decided at this point. I was just gonna figure it out when I got there. Then came the biggest struggle of them all, I swear, and that is actually getting the hoops onto the hoop skirt. I had never made anything quite like this. I've made that grand bustle, but it doesn't have the kind of finickiness that this hoop skirt had. Eventually, I did figure out, though, that it is best to start from the top and to measure each of your hoops as you go down as to where they are on those vertical ribbons before you even think about where they are in terms of the ribbons appearing vertical when you're done, which will help to balance out the hoop skirt and keep it from doing anything weird where it, like, goes to one side. It was also at this point that I realized, because of my scare with not being able to actually get the bones through the boning channels, which I couldn't at first, that I realized that I was running very, very late and decided to just safety pin everything in place instead of actually sewing it down, because I can always sew it down later, but I need the hoop itself to make the petticoat for the hoops. And I was running late doing that. This actually ended up being the world's simplest petticoat, but it was too late. The damage to my schedule was done. I started off with 2 3-yard cuts of 45-inch wide cotton. I definitely wanted to use cotton and not that broadcloth that I'd been using earlier, because I do intend to use this for other projects. I just pinned either of the raw edge short sides together, not the 3-yard long sides, and sewed those up, leaving one of the sides open by an amount. Doesn't matter too much the amount, I just kind of guesstimated. And it didn't honestly really matter how long that was, as long as it was long enough that I would be able to get my shoulders through the opening when the petticoat was actually completed. It's not like it has any visual impact based on how long your slit is. Then once I had a giant 6-yard in circumference circle, I ran a set of gathering stitches, 2 sets of gathering stitches along the top of what is now starting to be the petticoat-ish, and gathered those down. I ran 2 lines of gathering stitches because this is going to be gathered down very densely, and running 2 lines of gathering stitches, number 1 makes it look neater, and number 2, if you break one of those gathering lines of stitches, you have less of a chance that your thing just falls apart because you have the other line. Once I had gathered up these gathers as densely as I possibly could, I tied off the ends. It wasn't going to come out to my waist measurement, and I knew that, but it was going to come out just a little bit wider than that would be, so I wasn't too concerned about cutting it down in order to make it smaller, because I could always just use that as a bit of a modesty panel in and of itself. the overlap when I attached the waistband onto these. And the waistband is just a single piece of twill. I wasn't too concerned about the edges fraying because these long edges are actually the selvage edges of this fabric, so they're not going to fray. All I really had to worry about was the gathers coming undone, so I just stitched them down normally, and this is actually pretty typical of period petticoats. They were often just like a layer of twill tape or something in order to prevent the bulk of an enormous waistband from bulking up your waist. Then after I turned over the edges twice and sewed them down, it was time for closures, which in this case on the petticoat I measured where 27 inches actually was and sewed in one hook and bar closure like you would use for a skirt or a pair of pants. And for the hoop skirt, it was a single hook and eye closure because that's all that it was big enough for. I was actually kind of worried that my terrible hand stitching would collapse under the weight of this petticoat because it is very heavy, but so far so good in all of my test runs. I'm actually not terribly happy with the way that the hoops themselves look. I think they're a little bit lumpy and a little bit inconsistent, but there's very little I can do about it now, since I've expanded the hoops all that I can. But you know what I can do is hide all of my sins beneath the petticoat, because once the petticoat is on, it actually looks pretty okay, and it's definitely going to serve my purposes for my Halloween project this year, which, please pray for my rug. I have purchased 80 yards of glitter tulle. It was also only at this point that I actually genuinely realized just how big 120 inches of hem is. It's a lot of skirt. Like, I'm truly worried about knocking something over. Sitting is easy, but not knocking something over is a little worrisome. Like this video if you liked this video, and hit subscribe if you want to see me destroy my carpet with 80 yards of glitter tulle pulled into ruffles. Like this video if you liked this video. Consider hitting subscribe if you'd like to see me destroy my carpet with all that glitter tulle, and for the pretty costume as well. Also consider joining my Discord for crafty folk and donating to my Ko-fi, links below.